Hitler didn't just want Leningrad, he wanted it erased. Surround the city, seal it off, and let hunger finish what German forces had started. Wipe out 3 million people without paying the price of street fighting. That was the plan. And for a while, it looked like it might work. Leningrad was Russia's second city, the birthplace of the revolution that put Stalin's government in power. And that history made it a target Hitler wanted gone, not just captured. Nearly 3 million people called it home in the summer of 1941, a population that had no reason to think its own city would become a battlefield. The invasion reached Soviet territory in June 1941, and within 2 months, German forces had covered a distance most people in the city assumed would take far longer, a speed that outran nearly every Soviet estimate of how much warning the city would get. Evacuation began late and unfolded chaotically. Officials feared that organizing a mass evacuation would look like admitting the city was already doomed, a charge serious enough to end a career, while the German advance moved faster than the transport system could handle. By the time evacuation efforts picked up speed, the rail lines out of the city were already closing. Hundreds of thousands of people remained inside when the last routes shut, some because the evacuation effort had started too late, others because there was simply no way left to get them out in time. On September 8, 1941, German forces cut the last road and the last rail line running into Leningrad. Nearly 3 million people, soldiers, factory workers, children, were sealed inside a ring of artillery, and the way out was gone. That outcome had been anticipated before the invasion even started. 6 weeks before German troops crossed the border, officials in Berlin met to solve a supply problem: feed the army from Russian land or risk losing the war. Their conclusion was blunt: Germany would take what it needed from the occupied territories, and millions of civilians would be left to starve as a result. No objection was recorded. The meeting simply moved on. Then, in July, Hitler made the policy specific to one city. Leningrad was to be razed, and Germany would accept no responsibility for feeding whoever remained inside it. His chief of staff, Franz Halder, recorded the order in his diary. Within weeks, that calculation would collide with one city of nearly 3 million people. The starvation that followed wasn't a siege spiraling out of control. It was accepted months earlier as the human cost of Germany's own supply plan. Food had been shrinking for weeks before the ring even closed, and by November it nearly ran out completely. Manual workers were down to 250 grams of bread a day, about a third of what a person needs just to function, and other categories of the population received even less, some barely half that. On November 25th, the ration dropped again to 125 grams for anyone who wasn't doing physical labor, and the bread itself was increasingly bulked out with substitutes as the flour stocks ran low. Then one of the harshest winters in years arrived early. The pipes froze, the fuel ran out, and apartment blocks went unheated through weeks of brutal cold that the city had no way to prepare for. People stopped being able to bury their own dead. On the worst days, thousands died from hunger and cold working together, and the bodies stayed where they fell because nobody had the strength left to move them. Diaries from that winter described children who'd stopped playing entirely, who sat in silence with faces that said more than any casualty report ever could. Even as the city starved, its factories kept producing weapons, part of why Leningrad stayed a defended city fighting back, not just a trapped population waiting to be erased. But the planners in Berlin had missed something. Soviet forces still retained access to Lake Ladoga, northeast of the city, the one supply route Germany never managed to eliminate completely. Before the lake froze, barges made the crossing under German air attack, hauling in what supplies they could. Not every boat made it. Then, in late November, the ice finally held enough weight, and trucks started driving straight across the open surface in the dark, in cold that could crack a windshield, because it was the only route into the city still standing. German bombers hunted the convoys from above whenever the weather allowed it. Trucks went through the ice anyway. Drivers went through the ice, and the ones behind them kept driving, because stopping meant the city died faster than it already was. Leningrad's people called it the Road of Life, and it never carried enough. It couldn't. Hundreds of thousands of tons of food crossed that lake over 2 winters, and it still fell far short of what 3 million people needed to survive comfortably. Close to 1 million people were evacuated across that same lake by water and ice. Many of them children, moved out while the routes still held. The route never made life normal. It only kept the numbers from reaching zero. Every shipment bought time, and every evacuation reduced the number of mouths the city had to feed. If you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of story we cover every week. Back to Leningrad, because the ice road bought time, but it didn't end the siege. The ice road bought time, but it didn't break the encirclement. Through 1942, Soviet forces kept defending the lake approaches, while the city's population kept shrinking, falling from nearly 3 million people to well under 1 million between evacuation, starvation, and continued shelling. To the north, Finland had stopped its own advance at the old 1939 border, limiting how much pressure Germany could bring from that direction. But the breakthrough that actually mattered had to come from the south. In January 1943, Soviet forces finally broke through the southern edge of the encirclement and forced open a narrow land corridor along the lake's shore. Engineers rapidly built a rail line through the corridor, working under fire, close enough to the front that German artillery could still reach the tracks whenever it wanted to. It wasn't the end of the siege. One exposed rail line under constant shelling still wasn't enough to properly feed a city that size. But for the first time since September 1941, food could reach Leningrad without crossing open water or ice at all, and rations started climbing for the first time in over a year. It took another year. On January 27, 1944, 872 days after it started, Soviet artillery fired its last rounds at retreating German positions. That evening, the city's commanding general, Leonid Govorov, announced officially that the blockade was over. People who had endured nearly 2.5 years of hunger and shelling filled the streets to watch fireworks over a city that Berlin's planners had never expected to still be standing after everything they'd tried to make happen to it. Somewhere between 700,000 and over 1 million people never made it to see that night. The exact number will never be known. Records were incomplete. People disappeared during the evacuations, and later estimates counted the dead in different ways, depending on who was doing the counting. Most were buried in mass graves outside the city, without markers, without names attached. For years afterward, the government barely spoke about the famine at all. It was easier to talk about the courage than the cost. Berlin's planners had done the math before the invasion and accepted mass starvation as part of the price of the war. In Leningrad, that policy shaped 872 days of blockade. It came close to destroying the city. But Germany never eliminated Lake Ladoga. Soviet crews kept barges and trucks moving across it under fire. Evacuation reduced the number of people trapped inside, and in January 1943, Soviet soldiers forced open the first land corridor the plan had never accounted for. None of it made life safe. None of it properly fed the city. Together, it kept Leningrad alive long enough for the siege to fail, and for the ring Berlin's planners had drawn on a map in 1941 to finally break 872 days later than they'd expected. I'm Zombo. If you made it this far, you're already part of the quest. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.